With the release of the third episode of Rings of Power, we have now spent over 3 hours in Amazon's vision of Middle-earth, and it feels like we're still in the introductory phase of this series, with new characters still being introduced, and no real goals or motivations for any of the main cast. This episode follows 3 groups of characters: the Harfoots, Arondir, who is the original elf character created specifically for this show, and Galadriel. The Harfoots were in this episode the least, and yet we get some interesting insight into what ancient Hobbit culture was like in Amazon's vision of Tolkien's work. In this episode, the Harfoots are having a celebration before they begin their migration, and during this celebration, they honor those who fell behind on previous migrations. As according to this series, during a migration, if any Harfoot is to fall behind, they are left behind, but forever remembered in the Book of the Left Behind. This is of particular importance to Nori's family, as in the previous episode, her father broke his ankle and will struggle greatly with pushing their cart during the migration, thus leaving Nori's family at risk of being forgotten by the other Harfoots and left in the wilderness to die. However, Nori is still obsessed with the stranger who fell from the sky, who is presumably Gandalf, and so she decides to steal a star chart with the stars that Gandalf pointed out in the previous episode. However, she leaves the map behind when she goes to honor the Left Behind, and at that time Gandalf shows up at the camp to read the map and accidentally lights it on fire, causing him to freak out and reveal himself to the other Harfoots. Since the Harfoots are terrified of any and all outsiders, they decide that Nori must be left behind. But their leader decides that that would be too harsh for one so young as Nori, and decides that instead her family shall be pushed to the back of the caravan, where they will still be allowed to migrate. However, there will be no one to help them push their cart, which pretty much dooms them to being left behind anyway, since Nori's father can't push the cart. The Harfoot section of the episode ends with Gandalf showing up to help push the caravan, so that Nori's family does not get left behind. Now personally, I don't have any issue with the Harfoots being included in this story. However, I still fail to see how they're going to fit into the larger picture here, and what role Gandalf will have to play in the story, assuming it is actually Gandalf. There is a chance that the stranger isn't Gandalf, seeing as Gandalf isn't supposed to be in Middle-earth during this time period. However, seeing as Amazon has no issue taking creative liberties with this project, I wouldn't be surprised if it was Gandalf and they just included him as a familiar face that people would recognize. I mean, they're truly doing their best to make it seem like this character is Gandalf, seeing as he is an old wizard with a grey beard and a grey robe who is associated with hobbits. The only other direction I think they could take with this character is revealing that he is one of the blue wizards, since there's not much really known about them, even in Tolkien's writing. If anything, I really hope this plot point does start to pick up soon though, because it's really starting to feel like it's just a waste of time at this point, with no clear connection to the rise of Sauron and the creation of the Rings of Power. It's so disconnected from the rest of the narrative that it feels like a waste of time whenever we're with these characters. Moving on to Arondir's part of the episode, I felt like his parts were the weakest of this episode. His part of the episode reveals what happened to him after he was abducted by the orcs, as well as what happened to the other towns that the orcs have attacked. We see that the orcs have been imprisoning humans and elves that they have captured and forcing them to dig. What they are searching for remains a mystery at this point, although the characters speculate that the orcs are digging for some sort of weapon, though what that weapon could be I'm not entirely sure, though perhaps it could be the metal that Sauron plans on using to forge the rings. Upon awakening in the orc camp, Arondir discovers that the 2 other elves that he was working with in the watchtower have also been captured by the orcs. However, we never find out how they were captured, seeing as when we last saw them they were preparing to return home, and Arondir snuck away from them so that he could be with the human girl he was in love with. But it's never specified if the 2 other elves were captured because they decided to look for Arondir, or if they were just heading home without him and were ambushed along the way. They don't really bring up that Arondir had deserted them, and instead just immediately begin to plan an escape. However, one of their friends is killed off while drinking water, leaving Arondir and the other elf to quickly formulate a plan to escape before they are also killed off. However, it's during this escape attempt where you can really start to notice the amount of plot armor that Amazon has given the main characters of the show. During the escape attempt, while the orcs are trying to drag all of the prisoners back by their chains, Arondir is able to pick up a weapon and destroy the cover that the orcs have been using to shade themselves from the sun. After that, the orcs decide to send in a warg to deal with the prisoners, and while the warg is able to make short work of all the other prisoners, when it comes to Arondir, he manages to outsmart the beast unscathed. And while everyone else struggled to even land a hit on the warg, he effortlessly impales it with a spear and kills it in one hit. I found this to be very similar to the first episode where Galadriel and her company enter a fortress that was once controlled by Sauron, and are attacked by an ice troll, which none of the other elves can manage to harm. However, once Galadriel shows up, she makes short work of the creature. So it's really starting to seem like every character is incompetent except for the main characters, who can seemingly deal with any foe with ease. So once Arondir successfully kills the warg, his commander manages to escape. However, this part of the show didn't really make sense, as once Arondir's commander makes it to the top of the trench, he is suddenly hit by an arrow, even though we've never seen any orc archers. And the direction he was facing, there weren't any orcs there either. He just turns around and there's suddenly an arrow impaled in his chest, before he's hit by yet another arrow and dies. Yet we don't see any orc watchtowers that would have been able to shoot him. So where he was getting shot from, I don't know. And it feels like there really should have been more effort put in to have this shown off, as we never see any orcs with bow and arrows at all. I mean, when the captain first got shot, he turns around to reveal the arrow while looking devastated. However, I thought his look of devastation was due to him seeing how destroyed the forest was after the orcs had nearly clear-cut it. But then I realized there was a giant arrow sticking out of his chest, which I hadn't really expected to see since we hadn't seen any orcs with bows and arrows, and the plains that he was on seemed to be completely empty. So after his commander is killed, the orcs are about to kill Arondir when one of the orcs decides that Arondir is worthy of meeting Adar, who is presumably Sauron. And this episode ends with a blurry tease of what Sauron looks like. And then we get to Galadriel's part of the story, which I think is the most interesting so far, as we see that after being stranded at sea with a man named Halbrand, the two of them are rescued by Elendil, who brings them back to Numenor. However, Numenor doesn't really like elves for some reason, and we learn that the Numenorians have cut off all ties with the elves years ago. And now that Galadriel has been brought to Numenor, the Numenorians have decided that she is not allowed to leave, and must be forced to stay as a guest as they decide what to do with her. I found the visuals of Numenor to be amazing in this episode. You really get a sense that the Numenorian civilization was the height of what man was capable of achieving at this time. And there are definitely a lot of similarities between the architecture of Numenor in this series and Gondor in Peter Jackson's trilogy. I'm fairly curious to see where this plotline leads, as I'm pretty sure that Numenor was sort of like Atlantis in the Lord of the Rings world. However, seeing Numenor in this series has made me realize just how much history this series is going to have to cover, as it is the Numenorians who will depart Numenor and return to Middle-earth who will eventually become Gondorians. However, this also means that the entire kingdom of Gondor has yet to even be established, and we know that Elendil will eventually become king and fight Sauron, and his son Isildur will fail to destroy the ring. But seeing as they are both relatively unimportant people in Numenor, there are still a lot of events that need to play out before we can even get close to thinking about the final battle against Sauron. Once people from Numenor decide to depart and return to Middle-earth, they will have to found the Kingdom of Gondor, at which point they will need to construct Minas Tirith as well as Minas Ithil, seeing as I don't think those were built by other civilizations. And then after that we'll have to have the Witch King taking over Minas Ithil and turning it into Minas Morgul, and that is all before we get to the big battle against Sauron and how he was defeated. And obviously this will probably take many seasons to actually go through, making me wonder just how slow the pace of this series is going to be. I mean, what all can really happen in this first season then? Is it just going to end with the creation of the Rings of Power? Seeing as during this age, Sauron did keep a relatively low profile, so I don't think that you can really build up to a big battle against Sauron at the end of this season. So who's going to be the real antagonist that this series focuses on? If anything, this episode has made me really worried as to the future of this series, seeing as there is a lot of groundwork to cover over multiple seasons, and yet the pace at which this series has been moving at has been extremely slow. And with Sauron trying to keep a low profile during this age, it's hard for me to think of what could be included here to sort of pick up the pace. I'm thinking at least there could be 5 seasons that they could go through, with this season being about the creation of the Rings of Power, and the next season could cover the fall of Numenor. Then after that we could get a season about establishing Gondor. Season 4 could likely be about Sauron making his initial moves against the free people of Middle-earth, with Season 5 concluding with the alliance of men and elves finally defeating Sauron in this age. And while I'm not against slower series, They need interesting characters to carry them if the plot's going to move by slowly, and interesting characters are something that this show has been sorely lacking so far. So for being 3 hours into this series, I'm still not really invested in any of the characters, and don't really care too much about where the story's going. It's still a beautiful looking show, but it still lacks any sort of substance 3 episodes in. I still think that without the Lord of the Rings name being attached to this project, it would have just been immediately forgotten as soon as it was released. But these have just been my thoughts on the 3rd episode of Amazon's Rings of Power series. Have you decided to give it a watch yet, or are you still ignoring it? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, thanks for watching.